Hi there, welcome to Pamela Hignite Art. Today we are going to make a handmade air dry paper clay. We're going to use it to cover the armature that we made yesterday. The paper clay can be made first if you prefer, so it's totally up to you. And the paper clay will cover the armature like this fellow. All right. So let's get started. The first step in making paper clay is to shred newspaper. So I have a bunch of newspaper that's been recycled. I'm going to open up the newspaper and I want to tear down the seam. You do not want any seams. And so I have 4 individual pieces here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And I also want to tear across the fold here to make the pieces smaller. Okay. So you can tell that both of those tears were a little different. So when you're tearing with the grain, which is usually vertically, you're going to get a lot cleaner tears. Okay. If you tear across the grain, you have to fold the paper and tear very carefully, otherwise you get this kind of thing, which you want to avoid. It just makes the job of tearing the paper that much more difficult. You can still use these pieces, so I can kind of tear them up, shred them up pretty small, and use them in my paper, but I really want to shred this vertically. So after I have these 4 sheets, I'm going to tear them in half, overlap them, kind of stack them, and then I can shred them. I want to try to shred them in about 1/2-inch pieces. So, and you're going to get some wonky, fat pieces, but for the most part, you're going to get halfway decent tears. So anything that's too big, you can go back in and re-tear. Okay, and you want to do this to 3 or 4 stacks of paper, so just like 3 or 4 sections of newspaper. So once you've shredded all of that up and you have a nice dandy pile, you want to fluff it so that you separate all the pieces of newspaper out. And then the next step will be to put it in the blender and blend. Now that I've shredded up 3 or 4 stacks of newspaper, sections of newspaper, I want to fluff these because I want to separate all of the pieces, and I want to find pieces that are really fat and re-shred. It's very important that you don't have pieces of newspaper stacked together. That's one of the reasons that we open this up and tear at the seam first off. So we tear that seam and get rid of it, because if you don't, once you shred, you've got this double layer of paper, okay, that bunches up and it'll bind up in your blender and it'll cause you issues. So you want to make sure that all of your seams are torn. And you don't want to have to go back and do that after you're starting to fluff. So tear your seams first, okay? Now, the next step is to load the blender. Now this blender is kind of a smaller blender size. This is a really old blender, but this is the one that I use the most for making paper. A lot of the blenders today are bigger, so your blender size will dictate how many blenderfuls you make in order to follow the recipe that I'm going to show you. So with a blender that's small, you're going to want 4 blenders full of paper. For a larger blender, you're only going to want 3 blenders full. Okay, so when you load your blender, you want to, of course, pull this container off of the base And you want to take the fluff paper and you want to load it loosely, very loosely, into your blender. Might put just a little bit more in there. So you do not want to stuff this down in tight, otherwise it will bind your blender and you'll burn the motor up in your blender. Okay, then I put that on, and then this is where you add the dryer lint. So I've saved a bunch of dryer lint over the years, and I'm going to pull out a small handful, okay, and I'm going to cut this up into really small pieces into the paper. If you don't cut this up, it will bind in your blender blades and cause problems, and it'll burn your motor up. Okay. A moment ago, I added dryer lint to the paper that I put into the blender. The reason I put dryer lint in here is because the fibers add extra strength to the paper clay. You don't have to put dryer lint into your paper clay mixture. It is totally up to you. When I have my students make this, they don't add dryer lint. They just use the newspaper, the clay, and the glue. So it's totally up to you whether or not you want to add the dryer lint. For my pieces that I make, I do add the dryer lint to them because it does strengthen the piece. So after you have the dryer lint and the newspaper in your blender, you're going to fill it with water. So there's my container. So I have a container that I use and a bucket of water. I use 5-gallon buckets. I have a bucket of water and a bucket to drain the water and the paper clay into. So with the water, I usually fill a 5-gallon bucket about halfway full, and then I'll add a good splash of hydrogen peroxide. This actually helps the paper to break down a little faster. So put a splash of that in there. It also helps the paper clay to last longer before it goes bad. So a little hydrogen peroxide goes a long way. So I'm going to scoop the water out, and I'm going to fill the blender up. To about an inch and a half from the top. Okay. Then I'm going to make sure all the little pieces are tucked down in there and put the lid on. Then I have some old towels. I'm going to cover this with an old towel. You'll notice I also have the blender sitting on a towel. That way, if it gets messy, which I'm very prone to being messy, you're kind of covered. So I'm going to turn this on. And you should see the paper and everything moving. If it doesn't move, then it's binding up and you're going to have a problem. You're going to have to pull the blender off the base and put your hand down in there and break everything up. But if it's moving, you're good to go. So 30 to 60 seconds is good. That usually blends it up just fine. And you can take the lid off and pour your pulp through the strainer. And then you're going to repeat this process with a blender this size 4 more times. 3 more times. 3 more times. That gives you 4 times total. Okay. Alrighty, now we're picking back up with my last blender full. So I'm going to put the lid on. I'm going to mix this up. I'm just pretending I'm making margaritas here. bartender back in the day, long time ago, and I don't think any of my drink mixes looked like this stuff. So, yes, my students like to refer to this as poo. Most of them are afraid to put their hands in this, but I make them. You have to get your hands a little dirty, and I tell them it's just paper. So just kind of like, you know, play like you're playing in the mud. Pretend you're 5. And you're just pushing all the water out of it and down into the bucket. Some of my students actually kind of got into this part, but most of them they were very reluctant to do this. Of course, me, I was a mud pie gal when I was a little kid, so this is right up my alley. And so as you push the water out, you want to kind of pick this clump up and move it around the inside of your colander to pick up any kind of extra paper that is hanging on the sides. And then once you've got it to where you can hold the entire wad in a ball here, you want to wring as much water out of this as you can. The reason being, if you start to make the paper clay and you have too much water in this, you'll have no idea how much water to add to get it to the right consistency. So you want this to be pretty dry. So that's pretty good. So you just want to get it to where when you wring it, you don't have a lot of water coming out. So I've got 2 pretty dry pieces there. The next step is to put this in a gallon Ziploc baggie. And you want to break it up. So I'm going to break this into really small, like pea-sized pieces. The students just love this part because it takes a little time. So just put on some groovy tunes and just get into breaking up the paper. The smaller that you break the pieces, the easier would be to blend the clay into it, because you're going to be putting wet clay into this mixture of paper, and you're going to be kneading it together in the next step. Okay. Students usually make paper clay in teams of 2. That way one student is not doing all of the work. So if you have a partner that can help you, it's really makes this process go a lot smoother if you team up. So you can see the pieces are getting pretty small. Pulling everything apart. Okay, the leftover newspaper that I have sitting here, I usually keep a paper grocery bag around, and all of my extra newspaper goes into this grocery bag. Now when I'm making paper clay for my own sculpture, I go through a lot of paper. So what I'll do is I'll put this bag next to me while I sit on the couch and watch a movie, and I will just shred paper until I get a bag full. So keep all of your shredded paper. You can use it later.